John, personal finance is so important and so often overlooked, and it spans everybody, whether you're an entrepreneur or even just an employee. Personal finance at some point has to be where it's at.
Yeah, absolutely. Today we're sitting down with Barbara Sloan, an entrepreneur who is the co-owner now of Manhattan, who renovates properties downtown Manhattan, but also, more importantly, is on a mission, and she's the founder, money coach, author, and speaker of Tipped Finance. And the message she shares with us today, Rich, we really believe there's a pandemic going on, but it's not the COVID pandemic, it's financial literacy pandemic. She's attacking that head on.
She shared today things straight out of her book on systems and mindset that are great for personal finance, even percentage of savings and how you should consider debt in looking at abundance versus scarcity mindset, chocked full with takeaways. Here's Barbara.
This episode is being brought to you by IOI Ventures. We all know that digital marketing is vital to our company's growth. Unfortunately, many of us entrepreneurs don't know where to start. We simply feel overwhelmed by acronyms like CTA, CRM, and GA. It's time for all of us to stop feeling stuck because our partners at IOI Ventures have the experience and track record to get us moving in the right direction. Want to learn more? Go to ioiventures.com/EU and sign up for your free 30-minute consultation. Barbara, welcome to the Entrepreneurs United podcast.
Thank you, John and Rich, for having me. I'm so excited to chat.
Yeah, I can't wait to jump in. Obviously, from your bio, we know that you have a boutique women-owned contracting firm, I believe in New York City. So we got to dive into that and learn more about that route and background. But you also have a very strong finance background and run a company called Tipped Finance, personal finance media company. So there's a lot to unpack here. I really believe sometimes, Rich, we start with your present and tell us what you're doing now, and then we'll learn about the past. But I think in this case, we got to learn about the past first and walk us through a little bit of the Barbara story from maybe the origin to where it is today in a very short recap.
Yeah, so I was born and raised outside of Detroit, Michigan. Low middle income household growing up. A lot of family struggles. My mom left our house when I was 12. I was living with a primary parent who had substance use issues. I ended up moving out at the age of 15 on my own after that. At the age of 19, my dad, who was my primary parent, had passed away. And I ended up buying the house that I grew up in. This is 2003. So if you remember what was happening with mortgages, they'd give a mortgage to a house cat if you applied for them. And so
Hold on, that's when Rich was working in mortgages. We got to be careful.
That's exactly when I was in mortgages. It was when there was no licensing. You could literally be in jail and write a
good times. So I financed the house 100%, took out 10 credit cards at the age of 19 and renovated the house myself. This is before YouTube, Pinterest. I was at the library looking up how to mix concrete. And about a year later, after I kind of worked through my grief in the house, I ended up just being like, in over my head in debt, in over my head with just too much serious life stuff. And I just scrapped everything, moved to California, and started working in the service industry. And so for the next 20 years after that, I worked in construction and I worked in the service industry. I usually like to say dirt in the day and dirty in the evening.
Okay.
And then,
so you're there, and we're gonna have to dive back into some of this stuff. So keep going as fast as you want through this, because we're gonna dive back through this stuff.
Yeah.
So you're in California, or you're working in the contracting space, and you're working in the service industry. Then what happens?
Yeah, I liked moving around. Like I really liked going to Los Angeles and figuring out a new city, and I liked that aspect of life, just starting over. And so I proceeded to do that a few more times. I moved all around the country. I lived in Las Vegas. I lived in Boston. I lived back in Detroit. 2013 was a big pivotal year for me. My wife and I moved to New York City with $700 in our pocket. And I got 2 jobs when I started in New York City. The first job I got was working nights at a bar called Coyote Ugly, which I don't know if you've seen the movie or you know the reference, but you dance
Nobody
at the
orders
bar.
water.
No one
Can't order
orders
water.
water. Yeah, you sing and dance on the bar, you abuse your patrons, you get girls to take their bras off. It's a very good time. I made a lot of great money there. And then I worked days at a unregulated firm on Wall Street. So this was part sales trading floor, part independent sales organization selling use your loan products. We'll just keep it is loan sharking essentially.
Mm.
I was there for 6 months. And after our third trader got shipped off to rehab, I was like, I got to go back to construction because this is too toxic for me. So I ended up getting a job. I was employee number 3 or 4 for the company that I now own. And while I was at that company, I was tasked with setting up the accounting department and an HR department. I had never had HR before, so I had no idea what HR did. And so I had to start from scratch. I didn't know what a pay time off policy was. I didn't know what a 401k was. I didn't know how health insurance worked. I had health insurance maybe once in the last 10 years. I didn't know what an FSA was. I had no idea what any of these benefits were. And so it was learning all of those benefits. And then on the other side, we were working with these really high net worth clients, multi-million and billion-dollar clients, renovating mansions in New York City and getting to have those conversations with those people and how they thought about money. And when they had what seemed like endless resources, watching how they made decisions surrounding their budget and their money. It was very fascinating and eye opening to me, both of those things. Because I was like, oh, it is these systems and this mindset. That's the reason that I have personally not grown any wealth. And I was just like, that's also the reason that none of my peers have grown wealth as well. And so that sort of started me down the path of tipped finance. In 2016, we all know what was happening in the political climate. I did a media blackout. I was like, I'm not doing social media. I'm not doing anything else. And I just started listening to personal finance content. And over again, I just kept hearing the same recycled advice of don't miss out on your 401k match, skip out on the latte. I never saw anyone who looked like me who had built their career in the service industry or in construction talking about how to get wealth. And I was just like, this is crazy. We have financial services, and majority of the time they're just preying on these two industries. There needs to be somebody advocating for them. And so I decided to start with writing a book, and from there, growing Tipped Finance, which is a coaching practice as well and a speaking practice.
Wow. Okay. So first off, tell us for a second, and we'll dive into it later, but what is the title of the book for our audience?
The title of the book is Tipped. There's a subtitle. The subtitle is The Life-Changing Guide to Financial Freedom for Waitresses, Bartenders, Strippers, and All Other Service Industry Professionals.
Love it. Love it. Very targeted. I love that approach. All right. So let's walk back through this just for a second. Um, there's so much to unpack here. Certainly, where I would like to start with is potentially where we ended. And Rich, I'll have you go where you want to go with this one. But you said something that triggered the, well, hold on, what is it component when you said you were working with this construction firm, you were working with these high net worth individuals, renovating their mansions, and you started learning about the systems and mindset about money that you had never really about before. What were they?
Ooh, I love this question. So, starting with how much the person paid for their apartment and realizing that they weren't just going to renovate it with whatever they wanted. They weren't just going to put whatever they wanted into this apartment, that it was going to be relative. There were going to be rules of thumb for how much they were going to spend on a renovation in relation to the value of the home. And I was like, oh, to see them start with a framework in place for how they made their decisions. And then to see that the team that they built also came in with they had a broker on their team who was saying, if you want it to keep its value, make sure you include these components. And you had a contractor that was saying, if you want it to hold its value, make sure you include these things. And you had a designer who was saying, but this is your home. And so you're going to need it to maybe have these items. And so watching them set frameworks for not only their budget, but for how their budget was spread across the trades, how much they allocated to architecture, how much they allocated to the build, how much they allocated to design, how much they allocated to decorating. It was just very interesting to see it from a big picture perspective.
Okay. So to put it a little bit differently, they weren't just, I'm going to renovate my home. I don't really care. Let's just spend money. They took a sophisticated approach to the budgeting process. Even though they maybe had the wealth to do whatever they wanted to do, they had very strict rules and framework. And to your point, systems, advisors, everything else around how they were going to spend. And if I had to guess, it probably wasn't just about how they renovated their home. It was probably about everything else they did.
Everything else they did. So when they went to the stone yards, they weren't always just looking for the most expensive and rarest slabs. There was a range of what they were looking for, no matter what they could afford or not. And I just, that to me was very eye opening.
And what you just described, I don't mean to be quite so binary, but I guess I will. Is that a system or a mindset? Because whichever one it is, I want to go a little deeper on that and then switch gears. Is what you just talked about in terms of how much money they paid for an apartment, a percentage that they would allocate to renovation, the priority being hold the value first, and then yes, enjoy living there. Is that one of the systems you discovered, or is that a mindset?
I think it starts with mindset and then it goes into a system, right? Like you say, I have these financial principles. And then with that financial principle, I put a system in place.
Got it. Tell me about more financial principles that either show up in your book or that you work with your clients on that you learned in your experience that we could learn from.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people who are low and middle income, when you are operating off of either a budget or not a budget, which most people who are low and middle income are not operating off of a budget, they are unsure of how to adopt these rules of thumbs, especially for people who are earning fluctuating income, which everyone who's in the service industry is earning a fluctuating income, and everyone who runs a business understands what it's like to work on a fluctuating income. The first principle I teach people in budgeting is that you don't have to budget off of your income. You can budget off of your expenses. So if you have a financial system where your expenses are more fixed than your income, then you can create your budget off of whichever side is more fixed. So that's one of the first principles we teach. The second one are more rules of thumbs. Don't spend more than 25% of your income on your housing. Don't spend more than 10% on transportation. And those aren't hard and fast rules. Those are usually just rules of thumb to get you to start thinking about how to prioritize things in your life. And so I had never grown up with any financial literacy. I don't have a college degree. I don't have any credentials. And so when I started to deep dive into personal finance and see that wealthy individuals and people with financial literacy were operating with these principles, it was very important to me to be able to teach those to people who are operating off of that fluctuating income and working within these industries. So paying yourself first was another principle that I had never heard. I didn't know that you should be putting money aside first before you spent your money. When you're working in the service industry and you are operating off of cash, you leave your shift energized. And so you often go to the bar and have a couple drinks after your shift, burn off some steam. You spend what you have. What you don't realize is that the person who's working a 9 to 5, who's rolling up to the same bar, they are spending what they have left over. That is after all of their financial safety nets are in place. Their 401k has already been taken out. Their health insurance has already been taken out. And so when you compare what a person who is on a fluctuating income or in the service industry or even, an independent contractor doing gig work, when you compare your financial life with somebody who is on a W-2, you're comparing apples and oranges and you're not able to get a clear picture of how you should be operating in your financial life.
What a distinction that in a fluctuating income, the mindset is more of spending what you have when you're at the bar or going out to eat or you go to a sporting event. But the 9 to 5 job, they're not spending what they have, they're spending what's left over. I'd never heard that before. I think that's enlightening. What percentage of income is your recommendation, or do you have a range to save? And to save specifically for short term, mid term, long term, how should the average person be dividing that up?
So I always say 10% goes to future you, and then 10% goes to current you for savings. So debt is something that I think a lot of people carry in the US, and it often comes with a lot of shame and a lot of stigma. I personally just think debt is a thing that you have and you hold, and it's not something that you should feel ashamed of. And so as long as it's not over 6, 7%, I don't consider it hair on fire debt. Pay it off as you go. To me, it's more important that you are investing in your emergency fund and investing in your future. And if you allocate 5% to debt and it's low interest debt, I think that's totally fine. So maybe allocate 5% to your current savings and or whether it's a down payment, whether you have a big trip you want to spend money on. But that other 10% should be going towards future you, because future you is going to have a bad back. Future you is going to want a hot tub. Future you deserves a golden retirement. And I think that's one of the things that I talk about in the book, is that in the US here, we have something called Social Security, which is a big financial safety net. And for most of Americans, it is. It's just that, it's a safety net. But for people who are working in the service industry, which is 5.5 million people in our country, they are often not claiming their income, and therefore they are often not going to be on the receiving end of Social Security. So this safety net that the US government put in place to catch everyone who fell between the cracks of a 401k and a pension is not catching our most vulnerable people. Service industry professionals age into the most economically disadvantaged people in our population. And so that was also part of the mission of me putting out this book, is just that the people who wait on us, the people who work in bars and restaurants and clubs, and they stitch together this fabric that is our communities. They're the people that we miss the most during the pandemic. They're our therapists. They're our, they may be the only smile we get in a day. That's our sense of community. We're leaving these people behind. And so a big part of writing this book and building this business was mission driven for me.
Yeah, again, something I had never thought of, that people in the service industry not claiming income don't have Social Security on the back end. Well, they're going out and spending what they have. I could see how that mindset would end up with not a lot of money sitting around at the end. Tell me about, for those who are listening who have some debt on credit card that would often be 20, 23, 26% interest. When you say, yeah, if you have debt at 6 to 7%, it's not hair on fire an issue. What are your recommendations for somebody that has a few $1,000s to tens of thousands of dollars on a 23% interest rate? That is hair on fire. Okay, what now?
That is hair on fire debt. And so that 20% that we talked about that you're putting aside needs to go completely to that debt until it's paid off. There's a group of guys called the Debt Free Guys, and they coined the term, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank. It's a combination of the avalanche and snowball method, where you combine all of your debt onto either a single personal loan product or a credit card that is no interest for 12 months. And you combine it as much as you can and you reduce the number of accounts or cards that you have. And then it's easier to throw it all towards one card or one personal loan product. So you try to consolidate it as best you can into low interest cards, and then you throw everything you have towards it.
Got it. And when you talked about emergency fund or midterm savings, is there a multiple that you recommend of income, or how does someone know I have enough emergency savings? I now can take you said 10% future you, 10% current you. When do I go, okay, I have enough in the current you, I have enough in the emergency savings, I'm going 20% future you?
Yeah, I love that. That's such a great example. It's a great question. So the rule of thumb for emergency savings fund is anywhere from 3 to 6 months. Now, for your entrepreneurs, if your business is your livelihood, you may want to bump that up to 9 months. I have this renovation business. I carry 6 months of payroll as my emergency fund for the business. And then I have a personal emergency fund that's 3 to 6 months as well. So take your fixed expenses that you have reoccurring every single month, multiply that between 3 and 6. If you're just starting out, start with 3. Once you get there, work towards 6. But 6 months of fixed expenses should be what you're holding. When I first heard of an emergency fund, I was talking to a financial advisor, and I was blown away by this concept. I was like, I'm sorry, what? You want me to put 6 months of what I spend in New York City into a savings account, not for a down payment, not earning interest, not for a vacation, just sitting there doing absolutely nothing? I was aghast. So I spent 6 months reading everything I could about an emergency fund to try to prove him wrong. And it was the one thing that he was 100% correct on. So now my emergency fund is one of my favorite financial products that I have. It helps me sleep at night. We have an upcoming recession. It allows you a lot more flexibility in business, in your life. So it's the first thing I recommend for everybody is to start. If you're headed down the road of, I want to get better with my finances, I want to get better with my money, I want to protect my business, first thing I recommend is an emergency fund.
You just said something in there towards the end with a level of assurity that may be alarming to some. We have an upcoming recession.
Well,
Tell me
always an
how
upcoming recession.
that's true. At some point, there will be one. Do you have a recommendation on in the current climate in 2023? And I'm assuming you're saying upcoming recession sooner opposed to later. What leads you to believe we have an upcoming recession here? And what is the appropriate response for people when they feel confident there is an upcoming recession? What should they be doing?
There's always a bus on the way, and that's the same thing with a recession. There's always a recession on the way. So once you prepare, then you're done preparing. I've been prepared for this recession for 3, 4 years. Whenever it's coming, I'm ready for it. I only have to prepare for it once. And whenever it comes, I'm prepared for it. And so that's that 6 months of emergency fund. That's making sure you're paying down your debt. That's making sure you understand what levers you can pull on with your expenses if you need to reduce your spending. That's maybe seeing what levers you can pull on the income side of the equation. Have I thought about ideas for a side hustle? Have I thought about ideas for expanding my offerings in my business if things move in a different direction? Am I keeping my relationships with my peers, with other people who are maybe competitors? Am I keeping those relationships strong in case I need to pivot? So I think those are all really great things you can do if you think that there's a shift coming in the economy, which I'm not an economist, but listening to economists, listening to financial media, listening to business leaders, everyone is screaming recession is on the way. I have no idea, but I know that the same principles and tactics can be used to prepare for that, which are strengthening your relationships, building in buffers, and getting your mindset ready.
What's interesting, Barbara, is if you were to go back into history, and I could be wrong on the exact episode, I think it was somewhere around episode 70. It was Rich and I talking about 2022. It was our first episode of 2022. And we were talking about, hey, things may get gloomy here for a while. And Rich adamantly said, hey, if things are going to get gloomy, there's two things you need to focus on: relationships and building up your buffer of cash. And the reality is, what you're articulating now is that's what you need to be doing at all times, because there's always a bus on the way. You just don't know when it's going to come crashing into you. And so having that buffer of relationships, cash, and the proper mindset always has you properly prepared. And if we relate this to business and our entrepreneurs, it's having a strong balance sheet. It's having that balance sheet that can withhold the storm. You know, how many companies would have been able to withhold the storm without government printing tons of money and sending it to you with P money or IDL money or whatever? That's really what you need to be prepared for, because you don't know when the next bus is coming. And people think, we just had the pandemic, nothing's going to happen for another 10 to 15 years. No, we have no idea. That's what this current pandemic just taught us. You always have to have a position of strength with your balance sheet, and on a personal level, your emergency fund. So I love you articulating that. And I think really at a macro level, you focused your messaging around the service industry, which I think is fantastic, because focusing on that niche is so critical to the point you articulated in your mission. But man, oh man, financial literacy is a massive problem. It's a massive problem for our youth. It's a massive problem in schools. There are tons of people our age and older, retired, all over the place, that have 27% credit card debt and don't know what they should be doing about it. And so it's a massive mission to undertake. And I don't know what the answers are all to solve the problem, but I appreciate you getting your small piece in there with your industry.
Thank you. Yeah, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from people who are not in the service industry who've read the book, people who are gig workers and entrepreneurs. And the thing that the feedback I've received has been that I'm taking the same there's only 7 pieces of financial advice out there. It's the same advice for everyone. It's just about making it relatable to a different audience and about using it in a way that is digestible for certain consumers. You know, it's the same advice: pay down debt, operate off of a budget, protect yourself from workplace hazards, develop an abundance mindset, invest for your future. It's the same things, but the reason that I enjoy the way that I've decided to spin it in this book is that everything is analogous to the bar. If you understand what it's like to be at a bar or a restaurant, you're going to understand all of the golden principles for financial literacy. The entire investing chapter is a bar analogy. And I think for a lot of people in the service industry and a lot of people in construction, a lot of people in other blue collar industries find financial services and find financial literacy overwhelming, heavy with jargon, confusing. And when you're able to break down those things into a way that they understand, then people can be part of this. You're democratizing it in a way. I often compare investing to wine. You can get way into wine. You can get super into wine. You can talk about regions and tannins and body and mouthfeel and notes and all of these things. But you don't need to get way into wine in order to have a great wine drinking experience. You need to know a little bit, you need to know your tolerance, and you have a great wine experience. It's the same with investing. You need to know a little bit about your risk tolerance and just enough about the basics to get in and out and have a great investing experience. You don't need to know about calls or futures, or you don't need to know about bell curves. You don't need to be doing any of that to have a great career in investing. And that's one of the things I like to remind people is you can get in now.
Yeah. Barbara, I want to bring us back here because I need to understand a few pieces about you. I can definitely see in 2003 you saying, you know what, I'm going to build my own house, I'm going to figure this out, I have the work ethic, where's the concrete, let's go. I could definitely see that Detroit in you and that person coming out and going, look, I'm going to figure this out because no one's going to figure it out for me. And you start figuring all this out. 10 years later, you're moving to New York with your wife with, I think you said $700 to your names. And now you're writing a book about finance, you own a contracting company, and you're helping others, and you're on this mission. There's a few pieces that I'm missing in this last decade that you really went, boom, I'm going to go, right? Because what I heard you say too, which is a piece that I want to dive into more specifically right this second, is you started working for a construction company, setting up finance and HR department, and now you own the company.
Mhm.
Okay, stop right here. Okay, so you moved to New York, you have $700, you start working for this construction company after your stint, I believe, with the sales training company. How did you go from like setting up the HR and finance department to I now own this business?
Yeah. So the first, when you're anyone who has been part of a small business understands that you wear a lot of hats. And then most people who get into business understand that. And I think I was very lucky to be doing bookkeeping and accounting in construction for the majority of the initial part of my career. What I tell people who want to get into this industry is when you understand the numbers, you understand everything. When you see the numbers of a construction project, you understand how that project got built. I could see everything that was happening in the business, everything that was happening in every single project because I understood the numbers. And our business had a tragedy in 2015. Our founder passed away, and I stepped in, his wife stepped in, and we built this company back from scratch. And it was a very hard time for us to regain the relationships that he had, for us to build trust that we could do this. My business partner now, she had a background in design and engineering. I had a background in 20 years of construction, but not in high end. And so it took a lot of hard work for us to build this company, and we've grown it beyond what it was. And I'm very proud of what we've been able to do. But a lot of it was systems, putting systems in place, building relationships, and outsourcing as much as we can so we could focus on sales, so we could focus on relationships, and we could focus on oversight.
Got it. Wow, that's fantastic. Certainly sympathies for the tragedy and you trying to jump in. Okay, I'm going to figure this out. There's something you said there that's very core to my developmental story. When I was looking to go to school, I was originally grew up in Montreal and I was looking to come to the US to go to college. And I was going to go study business because I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I wanted to be in business. And my father said to me, maybe not exactly the same quote, but he said, no, you're going to go into accounting because once you understand the numbers, you understand everything. Didn't say it exactly like your quote, but it was basically something along those lines. And although I fought him tooth and nail because I didn't want to go into this boring accounting class, I ended up getting a degree in accounting. And it's been an instrumental component of my entrepreneurial life. And certainly if you're an entrepreneur listening to this and you have kids, it's certainly something to consider because once you do understand the numbers, you can understand a lot. But just understanding the numbers, because you had an accounting background yourself, worked in accounting straight out of college, from what it appears, right? As also part of your jobs while you were also working in the service industry.
I didn't
But
go to
that didn't necessarily
college,
mean you
but I
understood
started with
personal finance.
100%. So my wife is in corporate finance, and that same thing. She did not understand personal finance at all. In corporate finance, she started her career in 2008, and for a big defense contractor, she watched people in their 50s and 60s crying and weeping that they had to work another 10 years, and she was like, "Oh, the stock market? I want no part of that business." And
Mm.
so, yeah, it's interesting to see that that corporate finance and just finance in general doesn't cross over to personal finance. I didn't go to college. I started working right away and started with admin jobs and worked my way up into bookkeeping, assistant controller positions throughout moving around the country, working for different contractors. I worked for developers, I worked for new construction, I worked for people who focused on preservation while I was in Boston. I worked for utility contractors. Like, it was seeing all these different types of businesses, and my path of moving around and seeing all these different types of businesses and seeing all the different numbers, that it was always tell you like, oh, get good with the back of the envelope. But what I didn't realize was that I was training myself with back of the envelope math each time I started with a new business. And so it was like me getting to see all of these examples of businesses. And then I finally got an opportunity to do it for myself.
2016, you had mentioned all the political climate, and you went on a media blackout, presumably because you just didn't want to participate in much of what was going on in the news and what you were seeing on social media. You then made a decision, you're going to black out media and you're going to replace that time with a study in personal finance. How did you come to make a decision like that? Of all the things that you could study, you could have studied anything. You could have studied physics and astronauts and geology, and you could have studied anything. How did you come to go personal finance? I am going to go all out in personal finance.
I I hated seeing what was happening with our country, and I hated seeing everyone being divided and it just being, and I felt a little powerless, and I felt like if I could control things in my own life a little more, I would feel less powerless. And if I could allocate money towards causes that I believed in, then I would feel a lot less powerless. And so I figured if I improve things in my life, then I can improve things to help others. And then I won't feel so upset by all of this other stuff that's happening. So I just really tried to look inward a lot.
Hmm. How long did it take? Were you on this? I'm going all in on personal finance for you to get enough of the information, enough of the patterns to be able to then turn around and start to distribute what you learned?
By this point, I was already helping friends and family with budgets, coworkers with budgets. So I'm still consuming a ton of financial media. I would say I'm probably at 10,000 hours. If not, I'm pretty close. But I listen to it a few hours every day. I'm still reading personal finance books. I'm a big part of the personal finance community. I go to conferences, I go to seminars. I think there's a lot of potential here to help a lot of underserved people. And so I'm still constantly learning.
Hmm. Good for you. And you had said during that dedicated binge, not on media, that you had saw a lot of the same things. Match on the 401k, don't miss that, and skip the latte. You said, how is what you teach different? So if someone were to buy tipped, what can they expect that is what everybody else says? Hey, don't miss the 401k and skip the latte. What are they getting with your program?
Yeah, I think I'm probably one of the first books I've seen that talks a lot about boundaries in the first two chapters. I think boundaries are a way that you protect all of your resources, your time, your energy, your money. So, especially when you're working with the general public in places like bars, restaurants, and clubs, the general public has the ability to chip away at your confidence with questions like, what's your real job? And so protecting your energy and protecting yourself is a bigger part of the job in order to achieve something like financial freedom. I also talk a lot about mindset, how to build an abundance mindset. I think for a lot of people, we're walking around with scarcity mindsets. We don't realize that our traumas, whether they're small traumas or big traumas in our lives, play out in our financial lives, whether it's avoidance, meaning like we don't open our bills, we tend to not check our bank accounts, we don't like to look at the financials of our lives. It could be something like excess, where we're hoarding or we're spending in excess because we feel we deserve that. And those are traumas from childhood, adolescence that are playing out in our adult lives that are affecting our money. And so I talk a lot about, I have a whole chapter on mindset where we talk about how to build an abundance mindset. I have 4 strategies that I love to talk about. The first one is gratitude, building a gratitude practice, because it does something to your brain. When you are grateful for something, it's keeping your mindset in a place of abundance. Oh, I'm grateful for this thing. You're in a have mindset. The second way that I like to teach abundance is through identity. Start Your language is like anything else. It's a resource. And so you have to use it to your advantage. If you have saved, then you are a saver. If you have invested, you are an investor. Adopt those identity titles for yourself. If you are running a business, you are an entrepreneur, right? People in the service industry, a lot of the time, you are an entrepreneur. You're handling the beginning, the middle, and the end of a transaction. You are managing your own cash system. You are opening and closing an establishment. You're getting to see the back end and the front. Like, you are an entrepreneur. Adopt that identity. That will help you to create an abundance mindset. I also like mantras. For people in the service industry, one of my favorite mantras is money comes easily and frequently, because money does come easily and frequently when you're working shift to shift. So mantras are a great way to build an abundance mindset. And the last one is charity. This is another one that tricks your brain, where if you are giving something away, your brain is like, "Oh, I have enough to give away, therefore I have enough." And that enough mindset is that's when you're in abundance. So my book's a little bit different in that, yeah, I teach the same 7 principles in a really strange and unique kind of way, but I also talk a lot about boundaries and environment and mindset and other things that I think have big impact on your money.
Thank you for that. Can you give me a checklist of items a listener could check off on and say, if you resonate with this, you may want to look into personal finance. You may have a bit of an issue. Like, what's the warning list that you go, presumably what's on the list would include, you don't have any emergency savings. Let this be a heads up. If you have no emergency savings, you have some personal finance work to do. What else goes on that list that's like the big flashing warning list that if you identify with that, you may have an issue and you need to look into personal finance?
Can I say what doesn't go on this list first?
Yeah, absolutely.
Your credits. Don't worry about your credit score. Your credit score is the cherry on top of the financial sundae, but it is not something you should focus on if you don't have emergency savings. It's not something you should focus on if you are still in a debt payoff period of your life. It's not something you should focus on if you're still starting to get going with investing into your retirement. So oftentimes when I talk to people about personal finance, the first thing they bring up is, "Oh yeah, I've been wanting to work on my credit score." And it's no, that is not something that is going to matter for a while. We've got a lot of other things to talk about and put in place first. So yeah, if you don't have any emergency savings, look into personal finance. If you haven't started to think about your retirement, you may want to look into personal finance. I was someone who was always really good at saving, but I saved for things like big trips. I saved for things like a move. I saved for things like appliances. I never thought about 20 years down the road. And especially for people who are in those very physically demanding jobs, you have to know that you're not going to just want to work forever, and that retirement's going to come, and that you deserve a comfortable time in your golden years where you're not working. So if you haven't started to look into retirement, personal finance may be for you.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, even if the money stuff is just something that you feel like you can't talk about, you don't know where it's going. The money comes in and out. I don't really know how to save. I don't really know how to cut down on my expenses. I don't really know how to earn more. Those are all great places to start looking into personal finance.
You have quite a story. You talked about in Detroit, Michigan, that you were low to middle income. Your mom left the house at 12. You moved out at 15. Your dad passed away at 9. There's a lot that went into financial stress as in some of your formative years. And then later, in the podcast, you mentioned gratitude. I would love to hear from you. What have you found gratitude in your formative years, in all those challenges? Where is the place for gratitude for you?
Yeah, even when I hear people reflect on my own story and they talk about, oh my gosh, your mom left at 12. How could she
Yeah.
do that? How could she do that to you? And I'm like, she's alive now. And we have a relationship now. And that's what I'm most grateful for. She kept herself safe. I wasn't an adult. I didn't know what was happening in their relationship, but I know that she was somebody who grew up in the 60s and 70s, meaning that she didn't have access to her own finances. My mom, when she met my dad, could not have a credit card on her own, couldn't have a mortgage on her own. She was disabled, so she was totally reliant on another person for her autonomy. I have a lot of sympathy for this person. And so, whatever decisions she had to make, I'm sure they were not easy. And so, I'm just grateful that she made the best decision she could and that she's here now and we have a great relationship. My dad struggled. They both had hard upbringings, but they instilled a strong work ethic in me. They modeled home ownership. That was another thing. I'm super grateful. I never would have had the idea that I could have become a homeowner at the age of 19 had that not been modeled for me. Was it a nice home? No, but it still, home ownership was modeled for me. Other things that were modeled for me were debt cycles. And that was one I had to learn my way out of a few times. And most people do. You have to go through the debt cycle a few times in order to figure out how to get out of it. So I'm grateful both for the positive experiences that happen, but I'm also grateful for the hardships because they taught me a lot.
Thank you for sharing your story. I know there are a lot of people who have a very similar story, and through your courage of talking about it and coming to a place of gratitude for some of the things that would be easy to say, wow, that sounds really tough. And I'm sure it was tough, but to come to a place of gratitude is really admirable, and appreciate you sharing your story and appreciate you being on today. Thank you, Barbara.
Rich, John, thank you so much. It's a lot of fun.
Please stick around for a few more minutes while Rich and I break down this episode. Rich, one of the biggest messages that I think Barbara's articulating that I love, and she was targeting it and she messaged it a little bit towards the service industry, but it applies to everybody. The more that individuals realize that they too are an entrepreneur in their own life and should run their life and their family like a business that has a P&L and a balance sheet and a reserve for a rainy day, and they need to invest for future investments of their business. As soon as you start realizing that your family or your life is a business and you need to act and think like an entrepreneur, the more you would focus on financial literacy. The amount of people that I know that are entrepreneurs and or accountants who don't bother with their own personal finance, but yet every day are asking for the P&L or balance sheet of their business, and they're doing that in their business life, but they're not doing that in their personal life, I think is devastating. And I think we really need to sharpen up in that area across the board of financial literacy in schools, in colleges, for young adults coming out of college. It's such an area of opportunity, and that's directly where Barbara's attacking her mission, and I love it.
Yeah, and you have often said that we each run our own business within our household that includes a P&L and L and a balance sheet, and we should look at it that way. And many of the principles that we apply in business often go lacking on how we can have an opportunity to apply those in our personal lives. So this lined up with something I've heard you say on this podcast several times. I'd love to get your take on this abundance versus scarcity mindset. I feel like those are really broad. They're in the way that they're used, but they also can resonate with people on which one they have and what's the result of a scarcity mindset. Obviously, you want to have an abundance mindset. Like, what is your take on this abundance versus scarcity and its relatedness to personal finance?
To me, there's two components to this: mindset and perspective. If you think about people listening to this podcast, which is generally the United States, I think some Canada and maybe a little bit of Europe, but think about parts of the world where they don't have food to eat. That's scarcity. Some people live with a scarcity mindset here in America because they bought a house well beyond their means, or living in an apartment well beyond their means, or bought a car they probably shouldn't have been buying, partly because of ego, partly because of keeping up with the Joneses, part of identity, part of all those different types of things. And that's really a financial literacy mindset. I'll go back to a book that you and I read 25 years ago again. The amount of times I said that over the 4 seasons is amazing. We read a lot of books together.
Yeah.
The Millionaire Next Door.
Yes.
The Millionaire Next Door is the teacher who's making $50,000, $60,000 a year and is a millionaire. And across town, there's somebody living in the $1 million home who's making a few $100,000 a year that's poor. There's the scarcity and abundance mindset. Which one do you want to have? And it's all about your perspective. And one thing she talked about with the abundance mindset was gratitude. I get that. You have to be grateful for what we do have and the opportunities we have to earn and to do things. But the second one she said was identity. And what she said about it was treat yourself like a business, which I wholeheartedly agree with. But I think identity is also part of what affects or hurts abundance versus scarcity. Because if you want to have the identity of having the nicest clothes, the nicest car, the nicest home, the nicest this, you potentially might live a scarcity financial world where you just don't have the resources to do it. You're in debt. You have to declare bankruptcy. You got these different things. So I think identity's got to be tricky. You got to know who your identity should be based on where you are from an income generation perspective. But then if you have the gratitude and abundance mindset surrounding that, you can save for retirement. You can save for rainy day things, and you could build yourself a nice nest egg and a nice retirement fund to boot.
You bring up the Millionaire Next Door, and it makes me think of there's a lot of acting that's going on in communities where there are 15-year-olds who are driving $60,000, $70,000 cars. And some of those kids, I know their parents, and I can ballpark how much money their parents make, and they certainly didn't pay for that in cash. The amount of debt that they have just to do that type of thing must be enormous. And I actually think that comes out of a scarcity mindset. I don't think that comes out of an abundance mindset, that they're thinking that they have to provide something right now that's really big, that makes their kid feel good and look good, and somehow you deserve it even though you don't have the money for it. Versus I will brag on ourselves a little bit by saying our child drives a $2,500 car. And there are times where she says, oh, my friend drives this Mercedes. Yep. And it's like, wow, her parents are willing to go in debt. We're trying to teach you something that you don't buy a car unless you can pay for it in cash. And whatever you can pay for in cash is what you should buy. If you can't afford it in cash, then you can't afford that level of luxury. And that's just it. So we're trying to teach these financial principles at a young age and not do some of this acting. In the abundance mindset, she overviewed the gratitude, identity, mantras, and charity. One of those that resonated with me was identity. And the reason it resonated with me, John, I remember years ago that when I did a couple of half marathons, I did 3 of them, and it was about 10 years ago. And in a conversation with my dad, he said something about me being a runner. And I actually said, Dad, I'm not a runner. I just run. And from the kickoff podcast here, where I'm losing weight, I'm going to do a triathlon, and I really need to take on that identity. I'm training for a triathlon. The first one I do, I am a triathlete. It's not, I just do a triathlon. When she talked about it that way and said, yeah, if you run a business, you are an entrepreneur. If you save, you're a saver. Like, own that identity. Boy, do I wish I had that piece of advice 10 years ago to not correct my dad and to say, yeah, I'm a runner. Because I do half marathons, I am a runner. And I wonder if I wouldn't have slipped if I took that identity on.
I love the mindset piece, which is, you're right. I could definitely see you running a triathlon and your dad saying the same thing to you. Rich, you're a triathlete. No, I just did it. No, you're a triathlete. It is what it, like, own it. And this is, by the way, the concern I have about the word identity and abundance. Because if you want to have an abundance mindset, should you have the identity that you already have abundance and start spending like you do? And here's where I think Barbara's tips come into play. I'll disagree with you for just 1 second, just for purposes of illustration. I don't know if I agree that you should only buy a car if you have the cash to buy it. Just point blank. I don't know if I agree with that. I might, but let's just say I don't. But if I follow Barbara's tips, that you should spend 10% of your income on transportation. If you're making $40,000 a year, at best, that's 10%. That's $400 to include your car and gas and everything else. If you just follow that tip alone, on how much your month, $4,000 a year, excuse me. So at best, it's $300 a month,
Sure.
including gas and cost of car and everything else. If you just use the tips, 25% on your housing, 10% on transportation, 10% future you, 10% current you, and you start doing the math and you allocate your resources that way, and then you know how and what to spend. That's exactly the tip she learned from the millionaires in these mansions in New York who knew exactly how much they needed to spend on this home to get the right return on their investment. And she learned the mindset and systems that they used accordingly. And way too many people do the opposite. How much house can we afford? What's the house in the neighborhood we want a house so we can have the right identity? And if you reverse that around, and anybody listening to this, just take the calculator out, take your annual income times 10%. Are you spending more than that or not on your car? If so, you're overhoused. Now it's hard to get out of that once you're in it. You have a mortgage and all those other things. Now what are you going to do about it? Now the only way is to earn more income. And now you got to go find side gigs. You got to figure that out. But I think the mathematics of the tips are very powerful when you look at them.
And I get what you're saying, because when I said those in the community that buy a $70,000 car for a 15-year-old, I can see what you're saying, where one might say the person that did that, they're living it. They have an abundance mindset. That's why they bought the $70,000 car. And I think that comes back to what Barbara talked about around boundaries.
Yep.
And not just doing things because you like them, when she was talking about with the house, that it was all about holding the value of the house and first, and then doing things that you liked. So related to that, you go, okay, holding the value of the house in the context of a car would be, are you still saving enough to be able to retire someday? Are you still saving enough to be able to have an emergency fund? Those are the boundaries. After that, then maybe we can open it up a little bit for a little bit more of an expensive car for ourselves or a 15-year-old.
And Rich, when is the time to start this financial literacy? It's not when you're in your mid 40s and already bought your house and already have your cars and have nothing saved up and nothing for the emergency fund. And you go, oh, I should probably learn about finance. The time to learn about this is in high school, college, early careers. I love the fact that during our episode, I think you were like, yeah, I'm going to go buy this book for my daughter.
Yeah.
And learn that after we were done the episode.
Yeah.
But listen, I think financial education for our youth is critical. Financial education for our elders is critical too. But if you're listening to this episode and have not put in systems and processes or education for your kids on financial literacy, you're going to regret it.
I think the answer to when's the best time to learn about financial systems is the same answer to the old question of when's the best time to plant a tree, about 20 years ago.